What's going on, guys? Kalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G and going over whether or not the camera setup is good enough for daily use. Now, the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G is a pretty good phone for the money with decent performance and a surprisingly good amount of features for just being an entry-level 5G phone. But in the age of social media and mobile photography, the camera setup is one of the most important features to a lot of people when shopping for a smartphone. So we're going to go over this phone's various camera features and the quality of the photos it takes to help you decide whether or not it's good enough for you. Now, if you want to learn more about this phone's specs and features in general, be sure to check out the full review of it on the channel. But with that being said, let's get into it. So to start off, let's take a look at the front-facing camera. Now, with the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G, we're getting a water drop notch design for the front-facing camera. Not the best looking out there, but also not the worst either. And this camera is 5 megapixels, so maybe not the most powerful out there, but let's take a look at what it can do. So this first picture here was taken in pretty decent lighting, and keep in mind the lights in this room are daylight colored, so it's pretty much the purest white light you can possibly get. The colors aren't too bad, it's a little bit dull, but considering the photo was taken again in really bright white lighting, it's not too surprising, and the details, while not being the sharpest out there, are still pretty good for just being a 5 megapixel camera. Now, this photo was taken with a similar level of lighting, but this time the lights were a little bit warmer instead of being more of a neutral daylight. I do think this photo looks a lot better, the details are a little bit sharper, and the colors look better in general. So overall, while this might not be the most powerful selfie camera out there, you still can get some nice photos with it in the right lighting. Now, on the other hand, this photo was taken in really bad lighting. Essentially, it was just a room lit by one lamp and nothing else. And for how bad the lighting was, I was actually surprised at how well it came out. So even though you definitely do need really optimal lighting if you're taking photos with this camera that you actually want to use for something like social media, for example, compared to other lower end phones that maybe don't have the best selfie cameras, this camera really does hold its own even in bad lighting. So if you're using it for Snapchat or something where the quality isn't super important, then it still will get the job done. And then finally, here's a photo taken out in the sun using portrait mode. I am actually pretty impressed with this photo. Sure, the contrast is a little high and the colors aren't nearly as good as they'd be with a higher end phone, but for what it is, I do think this front-facing camera does take some pretty decent photos, and again, in the right lighting, you can get some pretty usable shots. Now, the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G has a pretty simple rear camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So the main camera is definitely the strong point when it comes to this camera setup. Unfortunately, there's no ultra-wide camera, which is pretty disappointing, especially considering the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE, which is the 4G version of this phone, does have an ultra-wide camera. So if it is important to you to have that feature, then this is probably not going to be the phone for you. But that being said, at 50 megapixels, at least the main camera is pretty powerful, so despite not having a whole lot of features, I do think this sort of makes up for it. As far as the camera interface itself goes, it's pretty bare bones. A lot of phones have a bunch of different camera modes, but with this phone, we're really not getting that. We have our standard photo and video mode, portrait mode of course, but other than that, all we really have is pro mode, panorama, food, and macro, so pretty much your basic camera features here. So to start off, here are some photos taken with the main camera using the regular photo mode, and I would say for the most part they do look really good. There's one photo here in super bright lighting that's sort of an outlier, but that's really a common limitation with most phones, let alone a phone in this price range. So keep in mind that although for the most part this phone does take really good photos, it does have its limits, and if you're taking a photo in really bright lighting, it might be a little hazy and distorted. But again, for the most part, especially considering this is really just an entry-level phone, you're gonna get some real good photos here. The colors are nice and vibrant, the details are sharp, and the lighting is pretty realistic, so in general, I don't really have any complaints. Now, of course, compared to something like a $1,400 flagship phone, these photos aren't going to be that good, so if you're coming from something like that, or maybe even an older flagship phone like a Samsung Galaxy S10 for example, then in that situation, it might feel like a bit of a downgrade, and if you really want the most professional looking photos possible, of course, you're probably going to want to go with a higher end device, but in general, if you're taking regular photos for social media or something like that, and you don't have super high expectations, then you're probably going to be happy with this phone. So even though, again, unfortunately we don't get an ultra-wide camera here, at least we do get some pretty good regular photos. Up next, we got a couple photos taken with a macro camera, and in general, I would say they're pretty good. Maybe not quite as good as something a step up from this like the Samsung Galaxy A33 5G, but definitely still pretty acceptable. Now, I'm not completely sure how many people out there actually use macro cameras. It does feel like a bit more of a niche feature, but overall, if you do want to get those close-up detailed images, then the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G will get the job done. Now, like I've been saying throughout this video, the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G does have a 50 megapixel main camera. But one thing some of you might not know is that when you're taking a normal photo in regular photo mode, you're not actually using the full 50 megapixels of the camera. But that being said, there is a special way you can use the full power of the camera, and while you're limited to the 3:4 aspect ratio, you can get some much higher quality photos. Now if you have this phone and you want to know how to do this, I will be making another video about that in the future, so stay tuned for that. But essentially, here's some photos taken with the full power of the 50 megapixel camera. So as you can see here, again, these photos are in the 3:4 or 4:3 aspect ratio. And another thing you're going to want to know about this mode is that these photos, despite being a lot higher quality, are going to take up a little bit more space. Now honestly, this isn't really that big a deal since after all, they're really only about 20 megabytes each. So unless you seriously have a lot of them, it's really not going to make a huge difference. But at the same time, it's still something to keep in mind. But in general, these photos are really high quality and I am pretty impressed with how they came out. And now, while these photos still aren't quite as good as something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra or an iPhone 13 Pro Max, they are a lot closer. So if you are trying to get those more professional looking photos, but you still don't want to spend the money on a higher end device, this is definitely a good alternative. But now that we've gone over what this phone can do photo wise, let's talk about the videos. So as far as videos go, with the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G, it's really nothing special, pretty much exactly what you would expect from a phone like this. We got a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so no 4K or anything like that. And the frame rate is also capped at 30 frames per second. So again, as far as videos go, we're really not getting anything special here. Now I'm gonna let the quality speak for itself here because depending on what you're recording videos for, it may or may not be good enough. But in general, I would say if you're recording videos for something like YouTube, for example, or maybe you're vlogging or live streaming or something like that, you're probably gonna want a higher end device that can do better videos. But if you're making videos for more casual purposes like maybe Snapchat, for example, then it should probably be okay. But again, it really just depends on your personal preference, so take a look at this video sample. So here's a test video with the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G. We are recording in 1080p right now, which is the max quality it can record in. And keep in mind what the audio sounds like. The autofocus is actually surprisingly decent. So in general, the video quality itself was pretty decent, so if you're recording shorter B-roll clips, for example, then you should be fine here. But in my opinion, the real issue is the audio. The audio is definitely not very good. So if you're recording maybe a YouTube video or a vlog and you're relying on the phone's built-in mic, then you're definitely going to want to get a higher end device. Because as you could see from that short clip, the audio really isn't very good. But aside from that, the autofocus was good, and while the stabilization wasn't the greatest, it's still pretty decent. So overall, while not being the best out there, the video quality with this phone is really not bad. Now I completely forgot about portrait mode, so here's a couple photos taken using that feature. Just like the photos from the main camera, I do think they look really nice. Again, recurring theme here, not quite as good as a flagship phone, so if you have something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra or an iPhone 13 Pro Max, of course you're going to get much better photos. But for a more entry-level device, it's really as good as I could possibly ask for. But in conclusion, does the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G have a good enough camera setup for daily photography? In general, I would say yes. Sure, on one hand, it doesn't have an ultra-wide camera, the video quality isn't the greatest, and if you're really looking for a good macro camera, then you can definitely do better. But if you're just taking regular photos or maybe using portrait mode, I do think this camera performs really well, and while it may still not be the best quality out there, for an entry-level device, I do think it holds its own, and for the average user, it will get the job done. Now, if you want to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out my full review of it on the channel, where I go a lot more in depth about its specs and features. But this concludes my camera review for the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to follow Kalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next one.